the whistleblower was not a tax person, and honestly, his grasp of the tax law was not terribly good. It was you spoke about feelings and about right and wrong earlier, and
Mhm.
a lot of it was this feels like it should be wrong, but textually, legally, it wasn't wrong. Like he objected that that Ensign Peak advisors shouldn't be tax exempt. And I think you can make a normative argument. You can make an argument that it should not be tax exempt, but you can't make the argument that it doesn't qualify as tax exempt. So in legal academia, that becomes a tricky line to walk. When I talk to people, I try really hard to differentiate between this is what the law is and this is what I think the law should be. And those are two different questions and two different inquiries. And a lot of the problem we run into is when we feel like what we think the law should be is also what we think the law is.
It is time for another episode of the Cultural Hall, and I am delighted. I am excited and delighted to be able to have Sam Brunson here to talk about all things. He's got a new project coming out. I'm sure we'll talk about that. Before we get any further, I have to give the proper shout out to Peggy Fletcher Stack over at the Salt Lake Tribune, who said, you have not spoken recently to Sam Brunson, and I don't know that we've ever spoken before at all, Sam.
I think this
But
is our first time.
but she said, you must. How can you not have? And so I said, listen, if Peggy Fletcher Stack says, then it must be so. So a shout out to her and welcome into the Cultural Hall.
Thank you.
Now, I want to talk about this new book that you have that's coming out. We'll leave a link for it in the show notes so that people can pre-order it and be able to order it and be able to have it. It's called Between the Temple and the Tax Collector. But I want to give people an idea of who you are. Certainly, with by common consent, people hear your name. You have written things, I believe, for the Tribune, and your name is out there quite a bit with other projects that have been done. So how do you say in that 30-second elevator pitch, I'm Sam Brunson, who...
I am a law professor at a Jesuit university, a practicing member of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, a big fan of jazz, a person who focused not actually with this audience, not the Utah Jazz.
I was going to say,
Jazz.
you needed to make sure.
I did need to make sure of that. I have nothing against the Utah Jazz, but as a non-Utahn who grew up in San Diego without an NBA team, I'm kind of indifferent to the whole basketball thing. So, so I guess I realize with this audience, I have to be clear when I say jazz. I research and write primarily about tax and nonprofit law, and it turns out that tax and nonprofit law often can intersect with religion and with the LDS Church in particular.
And it seems like in the last, I don't know, 10 years, we could maybe even shorten that to the last 5 years. I guess now it's 6 or so with the whistleblower, that it seems like the church and tax and all of this, like you are the guy that everyone is being tapping into to say, what do you think about this, Sam? Where is this going to land? What about this court case?
So I feel like I'm in a really fortunate position where I'm familiar with the church. Again, I'm practicing. I attend church on a regular basis, but also my livelihood isn't tied up with the church.
Mm.
And my livelihood isn't tied up with paying clients. So I don't have to worry about hurting feelings or offending people or saying what I believe to be accurate.
Mm-hmm.
And also, it turns out there aren't a lot of people in the tax field who focus primarily. There are actually several people in the tax academia who focus on religion. I have a colleague who just retired from Loyola Los Angeles, actually. I have who gave a lot of advice to various synagogues in the LA area.
Mm.
I have a friend who is a Protestant of some sort who teaches at Notre Dame, who focuses on this. Other friends who do this, but in the world of Mormonism, I am largely it for academic tax people who look at religion.
Mm. One of the things that strikes me about law is that law doesn't have feelings. And so many times we want to assign feelings within law, like we say things like, well, that's not fair, or they didn't mean to. Can you speak a little bit about that? Because I'm imagining that that will be pertinent to some of our conversation of law being law, whether it's, fair or whatever the thing may be.
So I think you're right. That is a misunderstanding that people have. Law can be fair. I would argue that law should be fair, but law is also ambiguous, and it's written and it's interpreted in ways that don't always reach the result that we might intuitively think. I was actually just speaking with a student of mine in office hours, and she mentioned that she had been talking to her dad about an issue that we talked about. And he said, that's not fair. And she was asking me to explain how it was fair. And the answer is, in this particular case, it's fair in most cases. And it's really hard to draw a line that is perfect and that captures all the edge cases.
Hmm.
So many times, even if a law is generally fair, you can find me an exception. You can find me a situation where it seems unjust in that particular situation.
So when we take that in a greater context, and especially with members of the church who, looking at these various court cases of where, most recently James Huntsman and the, suing to get his tithing back and some of these things, uh, where people have a lot of feelings wrapped up into it, and they want a case to go one way or another. The law is the law, and that's how things typically tend to fall.
Right. So in the James Huntsman case, his argument was not utterly frivolous. It is clearly possible that a church could commit fraud in a way that, in as it is asking for donations, as it's looking for money.
Mhm.
And to the extent that a church commits fraud in soliciting donations, it would be unfair for the church to keep that money, to be able to defraud people just because it's a church. But at the same time, just because you don't like what the church is doing doesn't mean that it defrauded you. So in
Right.
that case, the judges had to determine, because this was pre-jury, so the judges in this case had to determine whether the church had made a misstatement that was actionable, whether there was fraud, whether you like the church or not. As you read the opinion's pretty solid. I think they came to the correct conclusion. Whatever whatever result you personally or I personally was cheering for.
For people unfamiliar with that case, it's basically the crux of that no tithing money would be used to build City Creek. Is that, if you had to nutshell it?
If I had to nutshell it, yeah, that would be it. James Huntsman argued that in 2003, I think, then President Hinckley said we're not using tithing money to build a mall. We're using income from our for-profit businesses, and he said income off of reserves. And that ended up becoming an important statement. But James Huntsman said, I discovered in, I believe it was 2019 with the whistleblower,
Mhm.
that the church had in fact used tithing money to pay for City Creek, had put in something like $2 billion of tithing money. And the question became, was he defrauded in that statement? The church's argument was no, there was no fraud because we didn't lie. We used income from invested tithing money, which is something different from using tithing itself. Now, as an attorney who represented investment firms, that seems like a no-brainer to me. It makes complete sense in my mind that income on a type like investment returns on a type of money are different from the money itself. But at the same time, I realize as an attorney periodically that the way that I think isn't necessarily the way that the general public perceives things. I have special specific training. I have experiences that aren't shared by everybody. And so Huntsman argued it was fraud. The courts ended up deciding that no, when they say tithing means the amount that you and I and listeners pay to the church.
Mhm.
So I pay $100 in tithing. The church can either use that $100 or it can invest that $100. If it can get a 5% return, let's say, then end of the year it has $105. So the church says we use that extra $5 to pay for City Creek, but we didn't touch the $100 that you paid. And the court said that's right.
But it's not the end of it, right? There have been agitators or people that have said, "Oh, hey, I need to get my tithing back," for much longer than before James Huntsman. What do we feel like this sort of ends this, or will there be another claim or a class action, a class of people that will come after this, and we'll see this in the courts again?
So, as a practical matter, I don't think that this is coming back.
Mm.
This was in the Ninth Circuit, and there are 11 circuits plus the DC Circuit in the US. So, Ninth Circuit is California and some West Coast states largely. Utah itself is in the 10th Circuit. So, if this came up as a lawsuit in Utah, they wouldn't be bound by the James Huntsman precedent. The court could find whatever, not whatever it wanted, but it isn't required to find what the Ninth Circuit found. But the Ninth Circuit opinion is pretty compelling. It's pretty well done. I would imagine it would be hard for judges to look at the Ninth Circuit opinion and say, no, that's wrong, and we're going to rule otherwise. So, as a legal matter, it's not impossible for other suits to come up. I think it's hard. As a practical matter, I'm going to say it's probably even harder. James Huntsman sits in a unique position that he has a fair amount of wealth. I don't know how his attorney was paid, but I imagine that he paid his attorney on an hourly or flat rate basis.
Mm.
But these types of suits are often done on a contingency basis. So the attorney doesn't get paid upfront, but if their client wins, they take 30% of the amount that the client won. So with Huntsman, he can keep pursuing it as long as he's got money to pursue it. He's wealthy enough. If I wanted to do that, I could afford realistically 10, 15 hours of hype. Like I, I wouldn't want to be paying 100, 500, $1,000 an hour. I could afford it for a handful of hours, but not much more than that. So if the attorneys look at this and they say, I think that the Ninth Circuit's pretty compelling, I don't see any reason why, the 10th Circuit or the 7th Circuit where I live would find differently, then they're probably not going to take it on a contingency basis because there are costs associated with litigation for the attorneys. They're also, if they're representing one client, they don't have time to represent another client. So I would imagine as a legal matter, it's not entirely foreclosed. As a practical matter, I would be skeptical that you find many attorneys who would want to take this.
From your perspective, and you'll forgive maybe the crudeness of this question, but was there a part of you that was like, "Oh boy, I'm going to see this played out in a way that I can study and learn and be able to," from almost like an academic sense? It's like, this is everything. I can't wait to read everything around it.
Yeah, I have a strange sense of fun. I was checking the docket pretty regularly, hoping that something else would be filed. I'm not a big fan of performative lawsuits, and to some extent, this was performative. Um, Huntsman was filing the suit. I'm sure he wouldn't have objected to getting his tithing payments back, but also he wanted to punctuate the fact that the church is bad. I've discovered that the church is bad.
Mm.
Performative lawsuits probably go back a long time, but they seem to have really, really picked up right around the first Trump presidency. So like as a legal matter, I'm not a big fan because I don't like misusing judicial resources. But as a personal person, I had so much fun following this case. I had so much fun getting this connected with what I do. I love talking to journalists, frankly. I had so much fun talking to people about it. I mean, it if I went to cocktail parties, and I rarely get invited and I rarely have time, I have kids who have a ton of activities,
Sure.
but it's great cocktail party conversation. So yeah, absolutely. There was a part of me that really, really enjoyed this.
From a nonprofit perspective, and then dialing it back a couple of years, we said 6 years. We'll go with that. The 2019 whistleblowing, and certainly some ramifications from that. Is that of a similar interest, or are you more of the legal, and that's kind of like oversight or yeah, you know what I'm saying?
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
That honestly, was of a little bit less interest to me. It was a day or two of research and figuring out what was going on. But the whistleblower was not a tax person. And honestly, his grasp of the tax law was not terribly good. It was, you spoke about feelings and about right and wrong earlier.
Hmm.
And a lot of it was, this feels like it should be wrong, but textually, legally, it wasn't wrong. Like, he objected that that Ensign Peak advisors shouldn't be tax exempt. And I think you can make a normative argument. You can make an argument that it should not be tax exempt, but you can't make the argument that it doesn't qualify as tax exempt.
Hmm.
So, and actually, in legal academia, that becomes a tricky line to walk. When I talk to people, I try really hard to differentiate between this is what the law is and this is what I think the law should be.
Hmm.
And those are two different questions and two different inquiries. And a lot of the problem we run into is um, when we feel like what we think the law should be is also what we think the law is.
Oh, and then the gap between what we think it is and what it actually is, we get sort of mad or
Right,
disappointed, lost in within that. Um,
right.
Sam, let's take a quick break. When we come back in the second block, we continue this conversation. I'm going to talk a little bit about the new book that's coming out. We'll do that coming back in the second block of the Cultural Hall. I had an email from someone who listens to the Cultural Hall. I believe it was not a lifer, but a convert who said, "Hey, Richie, are you still teaching the podcast classes?" And the answer is yes. In fact, I have even fine-tuned it more than I ever had before. So you might be asking, well, Richie, how do I get on that? Well, you can always email contact@theculturalhall.com, or you can find me on social media wherever I'm at, Richie T. Stedman, and reach out and say, "Hey, I listen to the Cultural Hall. I would love to learn more about podcasting or your podcasting services, a class, a cohort." There's a group of people. I've even taught the ward historian about podcasting, what it is and how it might be a great benefit to people. If that's something that you're interested in, whether it's for your business or just for your private hobby, maybe something you see your future in, would love to be able to help you along the way. You can find me again anywhere on social media, Richie T. Stedman, or you can just contact us, contact@theculturalhall.com. Look forward to hearing from you. Let us podcast together. To be clear, this is still a show. Here in the second block of the Cultural Hall, remember, you can always send us an email, contact@theculturalhall.com. That is the email address. You get that hankering in the middle of the night, you can send an email. It doesn't wake me up. It's not imposition. Just send, "Hey, I really love that episode with Sam Brunson. I'm glad you guys finally got him on." Or, you talk to Sam, you need to talk to somebody else. You can do that. Anything you'd like, always open, contact@theculturalhall.com. So, we've touched on the Huntsman case. We talk a little bit about the whistleblower. It does seem like, as we kind of dive financial and sort of point the ship towards the idea and premise of your book, that the church has changed quite a bit around its finances since the whistleblower has come out. And when I say that, I see that we are speaking a lot more about the donations that we are making and sharing the amounts of those donations in a way that I don't think that we did prior. Certainly our temple building in number and value in a lot of those things are starting to show up. That to me says that maybe we learned a lesson, that the age-old Mormon trope of when we know better, we do better. Do you think that that's me feeling my way into the laws around this, or is that something that you can point to from your perspective and go, "Oh yeah, they're doing it different"?
So there have been some changes. The biggest change I saw was with the SEC um, enforcement action, what, 2 years ago now,
Mm-hmm.
where the church has had to become more open about its finances because the SEC did enforcement action where they found that the church and Ensign Peak advisors weren't complying with certain disclosure laws in the securities law.
Mm-hmm.
So now quarterly, Ensign Peak advisors lists um, the securities that it owns, that the church owns, and the value of those securities. So that kind of gives us a better idea of the church. And I also think that this discussion about the wealth of the church has opened up in members' minds some sense of um, thinking through what the church does with its money
Mhm.
and thinking through what we do with our money. It raises the question, what I mean, it raises the question of what should we donate? Why should we donate? What should the church do with its money? I've seen the church become more open about the amount it's spending on humanitarian aid. So
Mhm.
I don't think it's entirely imaginary. There's still a fair amount of secrecy around church finances, but I mean, the pendulum is swinging slowly toward more openness.
In some countries, I know that they demand far more transparency as far as the church and its finances go. The church in general conference used to say, and we have a value of this, and then we sort of ditched that away. Was that a legal thing that changed so the church didn't have to do that, or why did we do that once upon a time and no longer do that?
My understanding is it was a cultural change. Somewhere around the 40s or 50s, the church made a couple really bad financial moves and it was doing poorly with those. It righted the ship. It got its finances in order. It now doesn't borrow money. It's made a bunch of changes, but at the same time, with the embarrassment, it kind of shut down the public disclosure of finances. And so for the last 70, 60 or 70 years, it's just become the church policy. There's never been a requirement. So for many nonprofits, for many tax exempt organizations,
Mhm.
the tax law requires an annual financial filing. It's not a super robust filing, but it's a public filing. So if you go to guidestar.org or ProPublica's charity navigator, I believe it's called, for a lot of tax exempt organizations, you can find this filing going back the last 3 or 4 years. Churches have always been exempt from that filing requirement. And our church has used that exemption to not file these disclosures. Churches have the option to file those disclosures. They can file other financial disclosures. There's no law that forbids them from doing so, but there's no law that requires them to do so either.
So, I'm going to ask you to remove academia hat for a minute, and we're just a couple of guys hanging out in Chicago. We're getting a hot dog or a deep dish pizza or something like that. One of the things that has come about since the whistleblower is there was an interview where it was like, well, and essentially the sentiment, though not exactly these words, were we don't want people to know how much we have because they would be hesitant then to donate if they knew the sort of wealth, like between, not between me and you because lots of people are listening to this, but certainly, like, I believe that tithing is a Christian principle that God asks me to do. That seems to underestimate my commitment to doing something like that. Like, I can handle the big numbers. If the church said, hey, we're worth 700 billion, I think I would still donate because I believe in the principle of it. What say you, not academic Sam Brunson?
Not academic me says, I very much respect that, and I think I would go the same direction. But at the same time, I think that there is a risk, and I think it's a good risk. I think it's a risk the church should face. But I think there's a risk of people looking at this number and looking at the things that the church isn't doing and being disillusioned by that.
Mhm.
Um, the the church has a gigantic pile of money. And this is really hard because a lot of it is what my kids would call vibes.
Mhm.
There's no objective, like, correct number for the church to be paying out in humanitarian aid, in building, in like supporting housing, in any of those things. There's just not some magic number that is the correct number. And no matter how much the church pays out, someone's going to criticize it as being too little or too much.
Sure.
But at the same time, I see 150 billion dollars in assets. And maybe I think, you know what would be awesome with that money? The church could solve malaria or, could build affordable housing in the Salt Lake Valley or in Chicago, but they probably don't want to come here.
Yeah.
Or, I can imagine a lot of great projects that the church could do that would both help people and, you know, do the things that we tried to do back with the I'm a Mormon campaign. Give
Mhm.
ourselves a good name, get ourselves in the public eye. So I think it cuts both ways. I think that for many people, we would continue to pay tithing no matter what that number is.
Hmm.
I think there are some people who see big numbers and stop paying tithing. I think there is a middle group that continues to pay tithing, but maybe is, should I say, I don't know if I want to say disappointed or disheartened or something lighter than those words, but
Sure.
would really love it if the church lived up to that. I frankly get the feeling that the church kind of accidentally came into money, that much money.
Hmm.
They had reserves in excess of what they needed to spend. And as those reserves grew, no one was really looking. And it feels weird to say suddenly you've got $100 billion, but
Hmm.
suddenly they have $100 billion.
Right.
The impression I got from what the church said, you had people saying it's a rainy day fund or it's to build the kingdom when the second coming happens. All of that tells me they just didn't think about what it was they wanted to do with that money.
Sure. And certainly the optics around it as well, because to your point, right? Sometimes there will be people that will say, well, you could do 2 billion and the right answer is 4 billion and the right answer is, all of these things. The thing to me that I suppose I struggle with, and again, we're just two guys hanging out in Chicago talking about this. This is not official anything. But that I struggle with, that isn't necessarily the financial part of it, really. It's every year when I get called in to talk to the bishop as part of a tithing declaration, there's a discussion about my finances where, though not completely, I think it's like, hey, what did you make? And are you paying this? And it's, a fairly forthright conversation. And I sort of would appreciate that being reciprocated to me, because I don't know that I care. I just don't feel like, well, why are you asking me to do something you're not willing to do?
I mean, I think that's completely fair. And I think that there is a sense of that. I think that so I most of my adult life we've had the internet, a good portion of my adult life we've had Mormon blogs and Mormon discussion on Twitter and then Blue Sky and probably on other social media sites.
Sure.
Um, and I think to some extent, the church, again, was taken by surprise by the ability of members to speak broadly and publicly about these kinds of internal things.
Mhm.
And so at one point, the church maybe didn't feel like it had a need to be forthright with members. And, maybe someone didn't like that, but they couldn't find a community to express that or to realize that other people had those same concerns. I think today those communities exist. I honestly think it's a good thing. I am a big fan of transparency and of people speaking. And as an inclusionary matter, I'm a big fan of people saying both what uplifts them and what makes church harder for them. I don't think that we can fix the problems or even address the problems if people won't share what the problems that they face are.
So, again, this will be my last question. We're just hanging out. We're just having a good time here in Chicago. But so many times there are those people that need to see it black and white. And if you're saying that something is difficult with the church, boy, you, Sam Brunson, are anti, you're pitching your anti, rhetoric out there. Talk to me about how, a little bit more about that, about how we need to be able to say the things that are difficult, to be able to openly air them in a way, and then what is doing that and what isn't doing that, what is just being detrimental towards the church, or naysaying or anti or whatever we want to label it.
Right. So I'm very much an institutionalist. I believe in institutions ranging from church to employer to United States. I think we as a people need institutions, but I see institutions as having done a lot of good in the world and a lot of necessary things, but also bad. The church has done bad things that have hurt people. The United States has a noble history and it also has a terrible history. Um, and I think a lot of the danger comes when we assume that things are either all good or all bad. We assume that we have to disguise the horrors of U.S. slavery because if we acknowledge that we profited and built this country on the backs of enslaved persons, then that means that we must be evil and because we can't be evil, then that must be inaccurate. We need to hide it. We need to not share it. And I think that becomes a self-reinforcing thing.
Mm.
So I think the place for airing the problems we have is quite simply to build both a more resilient institution and a more resilient people. If I can say, and I've said this and I've gotten pushback, but over the last few days, I have written, I hope not scathingly, but at least aggressively about my disappointment in the church for not being more protective of undocumented immigrants.
Right.
I find that troubling at best. I find it off-putting, especially since friends and I have spent the last 2 or 3 years working at church with Central American and Venezuelan immigrants, many of whom were here legally as refugees, some of whom I have no doubt were here illegally. And I find that hurtful and disappointing. I find that the church isn't living up to its ideals. At the same time, I attend every week.
Yeah.
That I'm not traveling,
Sure.
every week within reason.
Sure.
I participate, I teach lessons, I listen to lessons, I try to make comments. And part of the reason that I do that is I want to model a world where I recognize the bad and still appreciate the good. I can recognize that the church, in my opinion, is significantly falling down in this respect. It's not living up to its scriptural injunction or its high ideals and its high rhetoric. And I can still attend and I can still believe that it is a powerful way to approach God and to approach Jesus.
I think it's a difficult thing. You mentioned, that the United States and slavery, horrible, right? I don't think there's anyone that's like, yeah, what a great plan. Uh, but when we put it in the context of the church, I think that we place different expectations because God's church, even though we always say the things like, wow, but it's run by man. We sort of do that, but then we don't allow it that it could make mistakes. It's like, no, it's perfect, but it's also run by man and they make mistakes, but it's a perfect thing. Like we just have this confusion, all these things that go around where we're like, we can't settle this, that this was wrong. This was an incorrect way of doing this monetary thing, the ban of the priesthood, whatever the thing is, we wrestle with it, but we don't ever come to any like resting place of it.
So constitutionally, that's the place that I live. I am much more comfortable with ambiguity and with gray than I am with the idea of black and white.
Mm-hmm.
But I understand that for a lot of people, that's uncomfortable. And I think rightly uncomfortable. It is a hard world to be in where you're a member of a church engaged in a marvelous work and a wonder. You're engaged in something that is important and salvific. And then someone comes to you and says, did you know that your church did this? Did you know that your founding prophet married a lot of people, including teenagers? Did you know that Brigham Young, the great leader who brought you west, countenanced slavery? Did you know that these other bad things happened?
Sure.
And I mean, often it is meant as an attack. And
Mm-hmm.
where it's meant as an attack, like my first impulse when I'm being attacked is to respond in kind. I don't pretend to be a good person. I don't pretend to be great at that whole turn the other cheek thing.
Sure.
It's something that I need to become better at. And I believe that someday, little by little, it'll work. But right now I'm not there.
Yeah.
So I completely understand. And this is getting back to your question. So how do we approach this? I think it's hard. Again, my blog posts, I've had a lot of people who appreciate them and are willing to go with it. But I've had people who seem to think that by saying the church is making a mistake with this policy, that I'm attacking the church.
Mm-hmm.
This one actually is more raw for me. My first post on this account, I basically said, I'm hurt. And I
Speaking
tried to do
specifically about the immigration policies
about the
under President
immigration.
Trump. Okay. Okay.
Yes. About the church not providing the support for undocumented immigrants.
Mm-hmm.
And I tried to approach it as I'm hurt. These are the reasons that I'm hurt. I don't want to approach it as the church is untrue because it's making a wrong move. Because honestly, as true as the church is, it has made and will in the future make bad decisions and wrong moves.
Mm.
And I think that I think to get to your question, how do we approach the fallibility of the church or other institutions in a way that isn't just attacking, in a way that isn't tearing down faith? I don't think objectively there's any way to do it that won't offend somebody, but I think that the productive way to do it is to do it in a way where you recognize the ideals of the church. You recognize that it's striving to be the Church of Christ, that it's striving to be something better than it is. Because, like you said, it is a human institution run by people that, even headed by Jesus, he's not here delivering conference addresses. In the end, people with their own life experience and prejudices and shortcomings and successes and power are the ones running it. And so I think we need to have some grace with them, but that grace also involves holding them to a higher standard, being willing to accept that. I think that there is something demeaning about just saying if they do it, it has to be right. That doesn't show the trust that we should have in them, that we're not willing to hold our church leaders to a standard and to a high standard.
Yeah. Well, and countless examples of that's not true, right? Like that's hard where it's like, yeah, it didn't end up that way. So now what do I do with it? And I think that that's where a lot of faith can get lost, certainly confused, and people can find themselves wandering in that gray area. Whereas you live in the gray area, but you're nuanced about how you perceive things and are able to kind of find your way through those things. Probably not always, I would presume. There are times that you're like, I don't know where I'm at with this.
I mean, you caught me at one of those times. The immigration thing is not easy for me. It's not going to drive me out of the church. But right now, I'm not really happy with our church leaders.
Yeah.
I think that is important. In high school, I had a close friend whose father worked for Campus Crusade for Christ, and he now teaches at a conservative Christian college. And he talked to me about how sometimes he'd go to the beach and he'd walk on the beach and he would yell at God. And that isn't a particularly Mormon mode of approach. I would, for various reasons, not feel comfortable doing that. In part, I don't really like to yell in public. But it is an approach that recognizes that even where we believe in God, even where we believe in the church, we can be hurt. We can be in a heart space and a mind space that we would rather not be in. And I do think we need to give each other the grace to recognize that happens sometimes. And I feel lucky that my ward, my friends, my congregation are generally willing to accept me where I am. And I try to accept them where they are.
Yeah, it's a big thing. Let's take another break. When we come back, we're going to go full on into this new book, what it is, why we wrote it, what it's for, who it's for, all the things. I'm excited to be able to get into that. We'll come back and do that in the third block of the Cultural Hall. BestDJinUtah.com is the website. That is where you go if you would like me to come and DJ your event. Now, will I do a family reunion where you all wear the same t-shirts? You bet I will. Will I travel to wherever you're at? Am I reasonable as far as what I cost? Yes. Do I bring a good time? Yeah, all the things. Listen, Best DJ in Utah, it's my company. It's a thing I do that allows me to be able to have the time to do the Cultural Hall. So if someone's getting married, you think, man, they need a great DJ. You're throwing a party, whether it's a 50th or 60th or 40th or 20th or whatever the party is. I've done them all and would love to be able to do that. An anniversary party, certainly done those. I did a baptism in 2023. Yeah, we did a big dance party at a baptism. Spoiler, not a Mormon baptism, but it was fun nonetheless. BestDJinUtah.com is a website. I will get back to you within 24 hours with a quote. Come on now. BestDJinUtah.com. Here in the third block of the Cultural Hall, remember to review this and other episodes. Leave us a review. Why don't you? You can do it on Spotify. You can do it in the Apple Podcasts if that's where you get this. Hey, I love Sam. He was great. Go ahead and leave that comment. I'll let you put those into your own words, or if you just love the Cultural Hall in general. Leaving a review allows other people to do just what you likely did when you're looking at something you want to listen to. You look at what people say and you go, oh, this sounds like my kind of thing. Or you listen or read those reviews and you go, this is not going to be my thing. We welcome them all, please, wherever you listen to this show. Take a moment and review. And I know there's a lot of you folks that have been there for a while that have never left a review. No shame. Just go do it. The name of the book, Between the Temple and the Tax Collector. I would love to know what this is. Why are you doing this? Why now? Give me the pitch. What is this all about?
So, the book comes from two different places. One of my interests is, and I'm not a law and religion scholar particularly, but I'm interested in the interaction of church and state. And we think in the US of the Jeffersonian wall separating church and state. And as a legal matter, there is a wall, but it turns out that wall is and is necessarily porous. There are places where church and state interact and intersect. Um, Sometimes it's mediated by the Constitution, sometimes it's not mediated by the Constitution. It turns out that in the area of tax law, it really isn't mediated by the Constitution. That is, religious liberty, we have a right to free exercise, but that right to free exercise can be limited under certain circumstances. Basically, where the government wants to enact a law, it has a compelling reason for the law, and there's no easier way to go about it. And the Supreme Court has held revenue laws are one of those things. Even if you belong to a church and have sincere religious beliefs that, for whatever reason, taxes are against your religion, you still have to pay taxes because the courts have said essentially the government has a compelling need, a compelling interest in raising revenue. And that compelling interest, there's no other way than there's no significant other way than taxes to raise it. So with the tax law, we've taken this constitutional mediation out of it. But church and state interact. They interact in a handful of ways. One is you and I are members of a church. We're religious people. We also pay taxes. The church is exempt from taxes, and most churches are exempt from taxes. But that exemption comes at some amount of cost is probably the wrong word, but some amount of entanglement with the state. Because if you want to be exempt as a church, you need to show the state that you are in fact a church. The state has to be able to recognize you as a church. And then if you're going to be exempt, you're subject to the laws that govern exempt organizations, like not endorsing candidates, not sharing income as if it were dividends with insiders, stuff like that. So we have a world where, like, and partly it's my selfishness. Tax is my area of expertise and my area of research. So I'm sure there are other areas like this, but tax is the one that I know. So one of the reasons for this book is my interest is in, one of my big interests is in this interconnection where church and state actually have to interact. Another reason for it, one reason for it is I am Mormon. I've been reading Mormon studies since the early 2000s. I've been in the world of Mormon blogging since the early 2010s. And so it's an area that I'm familiar with. I didn't have to learn a whole new religious history to do this.
Sure.
But another reason is there are surprising connections between the LDS Church and taxes. The first national income tax was enacted by the UK in 1799. And, Joseph Smith is born in 1805. The church is formally founded in 1830. So, it's a 30-year difference, but they're roughly coming up at around the same time. Throughout the 19th century, the church is maturing. It's figuring out what it's doing. It's getting its feet under it. Also, taxes are. Before national income taxes, you had various state taxes, but they weren't universal and objective taxes. Like you read about colonial and early American taxes, there's like a property tax, and it's got kind of a set rate, but the city collects the property tax after 7 years, and then 5 years later, then 10 years after that. And they kind of do it based on valuations that are very subjective. And over the course of the 19th century, taxes become more scientific isn't the right word, but they become more objective. they become more professionalized. So for me, one thing is it's interesting seeing this development side by side of the church becoming more sophisticated, more professionalized, and the tax system at the same time becoming more professionalized, more sophisticated. The LDS church is also unique, largely among US churches, in the roles that it has played in tax. So members are taxpayers. That's true for members of every church.
Mm-hmm.
The church has paid taxes. It's also been tax exempt. But Mormonism has two theocratic governments in its history: Nauvoo between 1840 and 1844, and then Deseret Territory between 1847, 1848, and 1852, 1853. And it was really interesting looking at these time periods because it's church leaders who are also civic leaders. And so, how are they going to operate the law? It is theocratic, but they actually enact like civil tax laws and other civil laws. So you get to watch them decide how they're going to enact taxes. And it turns out in Nauvoo, they basically copy the taxes from Springfield and Chicago and a handful of other cities. They put their own unique twist on it. They copy more or less the collection mechanisms. Occasionally, they reach out to bishops to collect taxes, but mostly they get a tax collector, which is the way that every other jurisdiction does it. That tax collector and assessor is responsible for figuring out what property is worth, giving tax bills, then collecting the tax bills from people. So it was interesting to me to see these religious people, and they're kind of feeling through it because none of them had, a background in tax policy or in like the administrative state or anything like that.
Sure.
But see them take the things that they learned as taxpayers and then try to implement them as government officials. Um, so that alone, those three chapters where I deal with two chapters for Nauvoo and one chapter for Utah were absolutely fascinating for me to learn about how does the church do this. And then there are, because I'm a tax person and a blogger, I sometimes get unsolicited information. Artist Parshall, who blogs at Keep a Pitchin' In and is an
Mm-hmm.
amazing family history and history person, occasionally would find documents in her collection and send me a copy of them. And I learned from her about this fascinating time period in the late 19 teens in Brooklyn. The church built its first church building.
Mm-hmm.
And then the New York tax collector came and said, "You owe us property tax on that building." And it turns out the tax collector said, um, the church said, "Wait a second, we're a church, we're exempt from property tax." And the tax collector said, "No, you are a foreign church," foreign meaning incorporated outside the state of New York,
Mm-hmm.
because it was incorporated as a corporation sole in Utah at the time.
Mm-hmm.
And they said, only domestic churches, churches that are incorporated in New York, are exempt from tax. So if you want to be exempt from tax, you either have, if you want your church building to be exempt from tax, you either have to incorporate here, or there are different ownership structures that you can do that will get you exempt from tax. But you have to do one of these things. And so for about a year, the church struggled, wrote letters back and forth between the church's attorney and the president of the Eastern States Mission, and their non-Mormon attorneys in New York, trying to figure out how to do this. And then they ended up with the structure that they ended up with. They incorporated the Eastern, I think they called it the Eastern Mission Corporation or something like that.
Mm-hmm.
I haven't read my chapter in a little while, it turns out. But that they kept that separate corporation until the 1950s.
Hmm.
In the 1940s, I believe, the New York courts overturned their earlier ruling that a church had to be a domestic church to be exempt. That also, I mean, that chapter I actually owe a lot of thanks on. Artists gave me the information. I discovered looking at the church history library that the church history library had some documents from that corporation. Only I don't live in Utah, and I looked at plane tickets, and plane tickets were probably more than I was going to make from the book.
Uh-huh.
So I called my sister, and she lives in the Salt Lake area, and she ran up and took pictures of a bunch of documents for me. So she and the church history librarian who helped her, I got a lot of help on that chapter, but it ended up being really interesting and fascinating.
So is this book some authors really appreciate this question and others are like, what are you asking me that question for? Like, who is this book for? Is it
So,
for the tax nerd that's like, I wondered how taxes and the church have interacted in their almost 200-year history? Or is it like, here's the case of why this needs to be not tax exempt? Like, what are we doing here?
so I hope you'll let me be a little self-promoting here because I thought
Yes.
about that a lot. Because taxes are not generally a best-selling topic.
No.
Mormonism kind of goes back and forth. Right now, it seems to be au courant. It seems to be popular, but not always. I tried really hard to write it in a way that people who know Mormonism and don't know or don't care about taxes can understand and actually enjoy what's going on.
Mhm.
I also tried to write it so that my tax colleagues who are only vaguely familiar with Mormonism would find value and would be able to learn about Mormonism. I hope that people who know both, and that might just be me, but I don't think it is, find something of value there. And I honestly, I tried to write it in a way that if you don't know anything about either topic, it gave you enough information that you could get into it. I tried really hard to write it broadly so that it would be intelligible, interesting, and worthwhile for anybody with any kind of interest in either topic.
When you
Uh,
talk about this topic and the countless hours that go into something like a book or even a blog post, as you've sort of mentioned, do you, when you put finger to keyboard key or pen to paper or however we want to use that, do you feel prompted before you do anything? And I don't mean like a vision that they're in your office, something like that, but do you wait until you feel particularly stirred? Do you like how do these things come to you? Because I would imagine lots of ideas come in and out of Sam's head as to what he could write about. What is it that gets left on the cutting room floor, and what is it that goes ahead, and why?
so I have a gigantic OneNote filled with ideas for articles and blog posts and songs that I want to learn on the saxophone and all sorts of things.
Mm-hmm.
And so I've got a folder specifically for this book. So I thought about it. I did a little bit of writing. I tried to do a bunch of research. What I have found personally is if I let myself just research, I can research and never put any words down forever, ever.
Mm-hmm.
I find my personal writing style is I figure out what I want to say by writing. So I'll be writing and then I'll get an idea. So I'll rush over to another browser or a library or something to try and make sure that I have the information I need for it. I'll assemble that and I'll come back. But I can't afford to wait until um, I feel prompted or I feel ready because if I do that, I'll never figure out what I want to write. So for me personally, the whole large language model AI thing, uh, if I were to do that, I would fail miserably at writing because then I wouldn't figure out what I wanted to write. So I write things on the cutting room floor. I was looking, I would have loved to have written. So the IRS has a big office in Ogden, Utah.
Mm-hmm.
And I started looking at some reasons why. There's some newspaper articles about it and stuff like that. And there was some thought about there was, if I remember right, it's been probably 6 years since I looked at this, but there was some connection between Utah and Mormonism and locating an office in Ogden. But it ended up not being really exactly what I was looking for this book. So I kind of left it aside.
Mm-hmm.
I talk a little bit about Reed Smoot in the book, um, but only kind of I give him a cursory glance. Reed Smoot was the apostle who became the senator from Utah in the early 20th century. And there was a big to do about whether he should be seated because of polygamy, even though he was never a polygamist.
Mm-hmm.
Um, he ended up being a big fan of tariffs and a big not fan of the income tax, and even at some point thought, what if we did a federal sales tax instead of an income tax? And I think that there is more to say about him. In fact, I would really like to write a book about him and taxes and tariffs. I would have loved to have included more on him, but honestly, um, all of his papers are BYU special collections, and I wasn't able to make it to Utah with the time to look at special collections. So I had to leave that largely out of the book for practical reasons. It wasn't necessary to the book. I got enough of what I wanted in
Mhm.
there, but I think that there's more to say about that.
Well, and certainly with the national conversation on tariffs, maybe it is a fertile soil now for a
It
Reed
suddenly
Smoot.
makes me realize I should have written this book about 3 years ago so that it could be coming out now.
Ah, see how it is.
Yep.
The name of the book for people that want to be able to pick it up. It's by Common Consent Press, and it's Between the Temple and the Tax Collector. There will be an a link in the show notes so that people can pre-purchase it or purchase it depending on when they're listening to this.
And it's actually University of Illinois Press.
Oh, University of Illinois Press. Sorry
Yep.
about that.
No, no worries.
Our good friends over at University of Illinois Press. I'm reading it from the By Common Consent blog that they did a big write up for you. So huge shout out for the University of Illinois Press, who does just some tremendous work in and around Mormonism. So thank you to those folks. Sam, there are three questions that we ask everyone who steps into the cultural hall. I will ask those of you. The first question is, uh, do you have a calling, sir? And if so, what is it?
Right now, I am an Elders Quorum service committee member.
Okay. If
And
you could pick a calling for yourself, either one that exists or make one up, what would you pick?
I would be torn between primary pianist, which is probably the best calling in the church, and Sunday school teacher because I like to teach.
Okay. And then the last, and I people find this to be the most difficult question. I think it's because of the reflection and contemplation that it takes to answer this question. No right answer, no wrong answer, but the question remains, what is your favorite part of your faith?
Yeah, that is an excellent question. My favorite part is at the current moment, the obligation that we have to serve people, to serve the stranger, to serve the poor, the obligation that Scripture gives us to give back and help others. And I say that from a position where I'm a tenured academic who makes a comfortable living. I can be very selfish. I can be very self-centered. I don't need much from other people. Like I like friendship, I like help, I love dinner invitations, stuff like that. But my family is doing well, I'm doing well. I can afford the lifestyle that I want. Um, and I am very capable of looking inward, just enjoying things I enjoy. After this, going home, cooking dinner, playing some saxophone if it's not too late to bother my neighbors. Um, buying that new mouthpiece I want. And something about the church pushes me to look outward. It pushes me to look for people who aren't as fortunate, aren't as lucky, frankly, as I am, aren't as privileged as I am, who need my help. It's something that I appreciated for 2 years. I have friends in our ward who put together a Spanish speaking Sunday school class for refugees and immigrants who had been brought to Chicago. My friends, they both serve Spanish speaking missions. They speak well. I served a Portuguese speaking mission. So I've spent the last couple years learning Spanish.
Mhm.
My wife served a Dutch speaking mission. She spent the last 2 years learning Spanish so that we can serve people who have done amazing things, have amazing levels of faith, and don't have the same luck and privilege that we have. So probably my favorite thing at the moment, and I won't swear that if I talk to you again, I'll remember and that it'll be the same thing.
Mhm.
But at least at the moment, it is this push for me to get outside of myself, to do good for people who need good.
Yeah, well said. Sam, I hope that this episode has nourished and strengthened your body, that if you're not healthy enough to listen this week, that you'll be healthy enough to listen next week, and that when the time comes, you will be able to travel home in safety In the meantime, we'll be saving a seat for you on the back row of the Cultural Hall.
Save me a seat, it's sure to be neat on the back row. We really gotta go on the Cultural Hall show.